All right, last session of the day. There's some people that's been with B-Sides Fort Wayne from the beginning. Chris Saylor's one of them. The other individual is standing right behind me. Michael Miller has been with us from the very beginning. Michael's just one of those guys that you know is going to be there and that I can count on. He presented last year. His talk was just phenomenal. We had to have him back for this year. So please welcome to the stage, Michael Miller.
Hey folks, good evening. Thanks for sticking around. I know a lot of people bailed around lunchtime, so I know there's a lot of things that you could be doing with your weekend, so I appreciate you spending some time here listening to me. I'm going to be talking about architecting defensive networks. So as far as our agenda, some quick introductions. We're going to talk about what defensible networks are and why. Talk a little bit about zero trust in practice, some attack surface reduction, network segmentation, secure access and identity controls, visibility and monitoring, threat detection and response, some caveats that come along with cloud and hybrid environments, some common pitfalls, and then hopefully a little bit of a roadmap and summary for everybody. So, about me, I've been in IT and cybersecurity for 13 plus years in a variety of different industries. I've done consulting, I've worked in telecommunications, I've worked in manufacturing, healthcare. I've worked with companies from that make less than $1 million annual revenue, so you think your mom and pop insurance companies, things like that, to $200 billion companies. I have a bachelor's in cybersecurity and information assurance from WGU. I have an associate's in IT and computer programming from Northwest State. I also teach part-time there. I have a whole bunch of different cybersecurity certifications. I try and participate in a lot of different organizations, InfraGard, ISSA, SANS Advisory Board, and a few others. As far as what I like doing with my free time, I'm a family man. I enjoy spending time with my wife and kids. Enjoy traveling. I also enjoy cooking, public speaking. Recently got into 3D printing a few months ago and messing around with my home lab. So I like to have very interactive talks, if you've not experienced this before. So I like to get to know my audience. So how many of you are responsible for architecture or security architecture in your environments? A few of you? Okay, awesome. How many of you are cybersecurity professionals? Okay, a few of you. How many are IT professionals? Okay, a few more. How many are students? Okay. Any managers here? Okay, a few of you. Awesome. So, why am I giving this talk? What was my inspiration here? So, after working for over a decade in the IT and cybersecurity fields, working with businesses of all different sizes, I've seen a lot of the same recurring challenges. And hopefully, what we can do here is teach you some ways to resolve some of those, or at least help get you closer. Anybody else having an issue with the echo? I don't listen a little too close. Is that any better? Yeah. I also enjoy teaching. If you talk to my wife, she'd probably say I enjoy talking. One of the big inspirations for this as far as content goes, SANS SEC 530, Defensible Security Architecture and Engineering. I did this course last year and got my GDSA. I will say, of all the certifications I have, there's two that I think are incredibly real-world applicable. This is one of them. The other is the CYSA Plus. If you're going to do any sort of SOC work, the CYSA Plus is fantastic. Also, the course that I teach at Northwest State, which is CYV 230, Network Security, covers a lot of the same material. So, I feel like a lot of the things that I keep teaching people over and over are some of the same things that I've seen challenges of. How many of you remember absolutely everything you learned in college courses when you were in college? Yeah. How many of you wish you remembered a lot of different things from some of your college courses now that you're in the professional field? Yeah. So hopefully some of the reiterations here. And then lastly, we're all in this together. So what are defensible networks? Defensible networks are networks and systems designed for prevention, detection, containment, and recovery from cyber incidents. The term defensible networks was actually coined by Richard Bailey in the Title of Network Security Monitoring in 2004. This is a quote from my SEC 530 class. And according to him, defensible networks can be watched. Anybody have any ideas what that means? Yes. They can be monitored. Defensible networks limit an intruder's freedom to maneuver. Any idea what that means? So shout it out.
BoxNet.
BoxNet?
Box them in.
Oh, box them in, yeah. Network segmentation. Defensible networks offer a minimum number of services. So system hardening. If you don't need to be running all the services on a host, disable it. And they can be kept current, which means you can patch them. So, in the Defensible Network Architecture 2.0 in 2008, he coined the term the connect, which means monitored, inventory, so we have our asset lists, controlled, claimed, so we know who owns what systems, minimized, assessed, and current. So why do we need to have defensible networks? Well, is this mic on? Is that maybe the issue? Okay, I just feel like I'm echoing really, really bad. There is a lot of more complex threats that are happening all the time. And AI and LLMs have made that significantly worse. As Dr. Zero Trust was stating this morning, phishing attempts, for example, since ChatGPT came out, have increased 4,000%. That is insane. Traditional approaches are no longer efficient. So we used to have a castle and moat methodology for how we defended our infrastructure, because we had basically our office locations, and then we had a perimeter firewall, and then everything that was important to us was inside those walls behind that firewall. Well, now we have things in the cloud, we have people working remotely, we have a very distributed environment, so it no longer works. Controls will also eventually fail, so defense in depth is our only path forward. Tyler Durden in Fight Club said that in a long enough timeline, the survival rate of everything is reduced to 0. The same thing goes for our security controls. This is why we must have layered defenses. It's not a matter of if, but rather when. So we have to just assume breach. We need to assume the threat actor is already in our environment. And another quote from the SEC 530 class, modern attacks are inside out. Instead of attackers breaking into our environment, they are already in and then they're escaping, usually with our data. So, zero trust in practice. Zero trust basically means we never trust and we always verify. We used to have the trust but verify mindset. We need to change that. We need to assume that the entire network is hostile. We need to assume that the threat actors are already there, and we need to treat our environment as such. We need to take an identity-centric approach. We need to continuously validate who our users and the devices are, and we need to validate that with everything they do. We need to eliminate implicit trust. We also need to have continuous authentication and authorization, and micro-segmentation. So when we talk a little bit about segmentation, which is something a lot of companies are still even struggling with, micro-segmentation takes that a step further. And then, as Dr. Zero Trust put it, there's not a solution that a vendor can sell you for zero trust. It's a journey. It's a mindset. We have a big vendor problem. How many of you have tools that you can't fully operationalize because all the money was spent on the tool and not on the staff to manage it? A few of you? How many of you have had your company buy a tool because it was supposed to solve all the problems? A few of you? Okay. Yeah, we have a vendor problem. Attack surface reduction. So one of the biggest pieces of attack surface reduction is knowing what we even have. So for the CIS controls for the past at least 15 plus years, the number one thing is inventory your assets. Know what physical devices you have. The number two thing is know what software is on those devices. You can't protect your environment, you can't protect the assets, you can't protect the data if you don't know what you have. And this is a challenge that I still see businesses today struggling with. So you need to know what you have. The next thing is you need to look at what threats are targeting your industry. And you can do this with a combination of threat intelligence, but basically you're doing threat modeling. You're looking at what are your peers in your industry dealing with? What cyber attacks are you seeing on the news? What are threat actors going after? Are they going after data? Are they extorting you? Are they selling your data? Are they just locking it up and trying to get money out of you? What is their approach? Are they doing denial of service? What are they doing? And what are their approaches and techniques they're using? Hardening systems. So this goes back to that disabling unnecessary services, disabling unnecessary accounts, removing things like that. That's something that comes up repeatedly in the class that I teach. Whether we're talking about networking equipment, whether we're talking about cloud, whether we're talking about Windows, Linux, or Mac, disable unnecessary services, remove unnecessary accounts, limit as much as possible. If there's a vulnerability in a particular piece of software that might be running on a normal workstation, but because you don't use that in your environment, it's disabled, that's not a risk to you. That vulnerability is already mitigated. You don't even have to worry about patching it because it's unexploitable. It's not running. Implement WAFs. So a lot of the times, most of our customers and our businesses probably come through some sort of web application. And there is inevitably going to be some sort of vulnerability either in the software or the code that we put out, some lack of validation in some input field that's going to result in that potentially being compromised. By putting a web application firewall in place, we are helping mitigate some of those risks. So even if the application itself is vulnerable, we've got things in place to help make it to where it's not as big of a risk. Lock down egress traffic. Can anybody tell me why locking down egress traffic is important? Anybody? C2, DLP, yeah. Again, the attacker is already inside our network. They're inside out. So we're looking for beaconing. We're looking for data exfiltration, things like that. That's why it's very important. DNS is another really big one. How many of you have your environment completely locked down where only your DNS servers are what DNS calls can be made to? Yeah. If I can go out to DigitalOcean or Linode or someplace else and spin up a DNS server, I can exfil and query it from within your network. I can exfiltrate data. Can you detect that? Maybe. All right. Implement email security. Again, going back to the email increase since phishing increase since ChatGPT came out, a 4,000% increase. Implement things like SPF, DMARC, and DKIM. Authenticate and verify your emails that are coming from you to your customers so that you don't get impersonated in attacks to them, and so that threat actors cannot impersonate you to your own employees. Enable host-based firewalls. So usually we go back to the castle moat methodology. We use network-based firewalls for basically limiting everything. Once you're inside, everything's safe. We need to move away from that. We need every single host to protect itself from every single other host on your network. Because again, the network is hostile. Local administrator password solution. Does anybody know what that is? Labs? A few of you? How many people have it enabled in their environment? Okay, a few of you. So for those of you who don't know what that is, it is a solution that was put out by Microsoft, I want to say in 2014. It's actually a free solution from Microsoft, which rarely ever happens. But it's basically meant to manage your local system administrative passwords. How many of you deploy workstations where you're at? Okay. How many of you have a single local administrator account that you set up and deploy on those devices? A few of you. So is that on every single system in your environment? Does that same username and password work on every single workstation? If so, that's where Labs comes into play. It manages that through GPO, and it'll actually change those passwords for you on a regular basis, and anybody that needs to get those passwords can do so, but it helps secure the devices from lateral movement. And when we talk about our case study here in a little bit, that'll be an example of where that's one solution that would have helped against that. Block unnecessary or legacy protocols. So again, if you're not using SMB version 1 in your network, drop it. Drop it everywhere. If there's any sort of activity of it that comes up, build detections around that. We talk about detection engineering a little bit later. So if there's anything that you're not using, don't allow it on your network. Patch everything. So not just your Windows workstations and your Windows servers and your Linux servers every month. Patch your networking equipment, which I know requires a lot of downtime and forethought. You can't do it maybe as frequently as you can do everything else because it takes a lot more systems down. But it's still one of those things that you need to monitor and do. And then the ultimate goal for like hardening systems should be application allow-listing. And it's very, very difficult, I realize that, but that should be kind of your ultimate goal that you strive for workstation and server security. Only allow code to run on those systems that you want. Anything else is blocked by default. So, network segmentation. The three things we're looking at doing here is limiting lateral movement, protecting our critical assets, and enforcing least privilege at the network level. How many of you live in a house? How about an apartment? Okay, how many of you have more than one room in your home? Okay, how many of you have kids? A few of you. How about a cat? Okay, a few more people. Have you ever used anything like baby gates to try and block access or shut doors to prevent access into other areas of your room? Maybe you don't want the cat throwing up on your keyboard, or you don't want the kid getting into the bathroom or in the kitchen. Things like that. Those are examples of where you've segmented your house in such a way to try and prevent unauthorized access or unwanted access. Same concept for the network. There's three main types. There's physical segmentation, so separating hardware or isolating via VLANs. And VLANs are kind of a fun topic because ideally they will work for segmenting, but by default they're not going to give you what you want out of segmentation. The only thing they're going to do is give you a separate broadcast domain and cut down on the network noise, make everything more efficient, gives you a better strategy of how to approach things. However, they don't filter the traffic. You have to explicitly filter things out. The default behavior for a firewall is block everything. You need to explicitly allow things in a firewall. The default behavior for a router is route everything, block nothing. One of the guys at ONUG a few years ago at the Central Ohio InfoSec Summit said, I route, therefore you are. So the whole idea behind network engineering is getting traffic anywhere it can and needs to go as fast and efficiently as possible. However, that causes a lot of risks from a security perspective. That's where you need to also enhance VLANs by actually doing filtering, implement ACLs. Maybe instead of having a router or a switch as your segmentation gateway, you put an actual firewall there because it has a lot more capabilities for filtering traffic out and allowing things as you want them to. Then there's logical segmentation, using firewalls, virtual routing functions, VLANs, SDNs, things like that. And then microsegmentation, this is where we really get into the zero trust mindset. Which is workload policies. So you're using your host-based firewalls, not just your network firewalls, to limit what kind of communication those devices can even do in and out. Also, this is where container segmentation and things like that come into play. So, different design patterns. There's zone-based architecture. Most of the time when you're talking about segmenting your network out and putting in different firewall filtering policies, you're dividing things into zones. Whether that's DMZ, production, management, dev test, things like that. You can also take a role-based approach. So, user devices, endpoint workstations, servers, IoT, phones, printers, things like that. You're doing it based off of what role does this device serve in the network and separating it out. You might also do this via business function. So maybe finance is in their own network segment. HR is in their own network segment. Accounts payable is in there. Different things like that. But when you're looking at how to best segment your network, it's going to vary company to company. You're going to probably pick one of these three, but maybe not all. Maybe zone-based architecture doesn't make any sense for your particular environment, but business function does. The biggest thing to consider is the levels of data sensitivity that each department is going to work with, or that your company as a whole works with, and then what's the different risk levels there. And that's how you should approach how you segment things up. Different strategies. So one of the first things you need to do when it comes to doing network segmentation is understand the paths that systems and devices in your network take. Because if you just start segmenting blindly and blocking things, it's going to be a very bad day for you and most of the other people that work in your department. So this is not a fast solution. This is also why we're in 2025. Network segmentation has existed for a couple decades, and it's still not implemented everywhere because it is difficult. It is time consuming. We usually don't have a whole lot of time. But if you're actually going to do this, monitor what kind of traffic is going through your network at each location. So if you're going to try and segment it out based off of a business unit or device type, look at what your IP space is for that network. Look at what VLAN that is. Look where that's going. And then don't just add allow rules based off of what you see, because that may not be permittable traffic. There could be a threat actor actually doing things, and you're going to be like, oh, well, I see this, I'm going to go ahead and add an allow. Find out, verify that that kind of traffic is legitimate and should happen on your network. Add in your explicit allow policies. And then look and see if there's anything else that's going through. And then if there's not, then you implement your default denial. So that there's anything else that's communicating that other than what you've otherwise stated, it's getting blocked. So you want to do default deny rules. If you are starting from scratch, your default deny rule is probably going to be a default allow and the wall. That way, if anything hits that rule, you know about it. And then you can go and determine if that traffic is valid or not, put an explicit allow, or go ahead and wait until you're actually flipping the block. Or maybe if it's bad enough, put in an explicit block. Start with quick and easy wins. Start with ones that aren't overly complicated. Things like, printers. Most users don't print to a printer. They print to a print server, and then that print server sends messages to the printer. So maybe only the print server needs to communicate with the printers, or maybe a couple of admin workstations, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But otherwise, regular end users shouldn't be talking to printers. Same probably goes for phones. They don't need to talk to each phone. They might need to talk to the phone server, especially if there's some sort of chat client or something to use, but they're not usually communicating directly with the phones. Leverage things like network access controls and 802.1x authentication to automatically provision and assign VLANs and policies based off of what kind of device it is, what users using that device, things like that. You can get really granular and you can automate that whole process. Also, when it comes to the case of automation and orchestration, use things like Ansible, Chef, or Puppet to actually manage your network infrastructure. One of the things I love about Ansible, if you're not already familiar with it, is anything that can accept a secure shell connection can be managed by Ansible, regardless of what it is, whether it's network equipment, whether it's servers, whatever. That's one of the beautiful things about Ansible. And then depending on whether or not you can leverage modules that are native to Ansible, depends on what it is and if you can install the necessary packages. But a switch, you can't do that, but you can still manage it via SSH. So you can still leverage that management automation capability to deploy your switches in an automated fashion. And then use bastion hosts, also sometimes called jump hosts or administrative workstations, for pivoting between segments where applicable. So certain times, certain members of IT or even security are going to need to pivot from one segment to another, or going to need to manage certain things, like maybe your domain controllers. Don't allow them to go directly from their workstation to those very, very sensitive systems. Have them use some sort of a bastion host or a jump box that they get into and then pivot from there. Maybe there's extra logging and everything that happens in that particular workstation, and it's the only way so you're watching to see if that box is compromised a lot more than any other. And there's also usually a lot less risk because maybe you don't allow internet connectivity from that box, you don't allow email on that box, so there's a lot of less risk of something happening on that particular box. Secure access and identity controls. So least privilege access, not just for users, but for devices. So we talk a lot about least privilege, and we usually talk about users. We should also be looking at it from the system perspective, and that's where things like host-based firewalls, network segmentation, potentially even private VLANs, all that kind of stuff, and NAC allows us to do that a lot more effectively. And then assess it and recertify it regularly. Multi-factor authentication. So MFA is another one of those things that's been around for quite a while. How many of you have MFA fully implemented for absolutely everything in your environment? Yeah. How about for all of your external facing systems, including cloud? Okay. How about for all administrative functions? Anytime someone's logging in as a domain admin, awesome, there's a few of you, awesome. How many of you that mentioned that or do have some sort of MFA enabled for like administrative workstations or whatever, have push notifications enabled? Okay. Do you have additional validation for those, like where you have to pick an additional number or something like that of what's on the screen, or is it just hit approve? How many of you have just where you hit approve? Few of you. Okay, so there's an attack known as MFA fatigue, which is basically spamming an individual with those push notifications if the account is compromised until they eventually just get tired of it and approve so the thing goes away. And when that happens, the threat actor has full access and MFA has been completely defeated. Now, there's been plenty of real-world cases where this has happened to IT folks, usually in the middle of the night. Now, as the individual that I am, my mentality on that is if someone's spamming me with those, I'm going to probably be pretty ticked off and be ready to go after that individual rather than approve. And that might sound well and good in my head, but what happens if that comes at 3 o'clock in the morning and I'm sleeping and I'm just barely like not conscious? How many of you have overslept an alarm and been late for something in your life? Okay. How many of you have set up multiple alarms so that way you didn't oversleep and somehow still managed to subconsciously shut all those off and oversleep? Yeah. So what do you think is going to happen if your phone's buzzing and it's like just needing you to hit that push notification? You're probably going to be fumbling around trying to snooze it, and the next thing you know, there's a threat actor and you're getting a call from your boss or from someone higher up in the company going, we've got a problem. So don't leverage that for high-profile authentication. Try and do something else that has an additional layer of authentication beyond just that. Validate like with a number that's on a screen or something like that. Okta, Microsoft, a lot of those that already have that kind of additional feature in it. Same thing goes with SMS-based authentication for MFA. That works for a lot of regular, non-critical employees. Like usually hourly staff or something like that needs to get in. You're not going to provide them with a hardware token or something like that. You might just have SMS-based authentication. They might not even be okay putting like Google Authenticator or something on their phone. So that's fine for them, but any high-profile targets, CEO of the organization, CFO, things like that, do not use SMS-based authentication. Because inevitably there's a good possibility they're the ones that are going to be targeted for SIM swap. Privileged access management. How many of you have your administrative accounts completely separate from your regular accounts? Okay, a few of you. How many of you log into absolutely every single thing that you log into as a domain admin? Okay, good. Nobody raised their hand for that. How about half the stuff that you log in? Anytime you log into a server, you log in as a domain admin. Okay, couple. The problem with that is, what happens if you accidentally do the wrong thing? Or if you happen to log into a system that's compromised? Well, your credentials for the highest privilege account in the environment is now cached in that device. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about the case study. But try and have those separated. Use rotating credentials for things like that. One of the things you can use with like a PAM-based solution is usually where you check out a credential, you use it for the particular purpose, and when you check it back in, it automatically rotates that credential. So that way, that particular password, even if you saved it somewhere, can never be used again because it's already been changed. And then risk-based or attribute-based, risk-based or attribute-based account creations. So using role-based authentication, trying to determine what kind of privileges and stuff someone should get based off of the particular role or thing they do for your company. Visibility monitoring. So Continuous monitoring is essential for early threat detection. It helps us understand and baseline behavior, so that way we can determine when something is anomalous. And it helps to provide us with forensic evidence and compliance assurance. And also, when we talk about compliance, again, like Dr. Zero Trust mentioned this morning, compliance is the floor. That's where we're starting from. It's not the ultimate goal. Visibility and monitoring. So what should we be monitoring? Things like network traffic. We should be monitoring net flows. Even if we can't afford to do full packet capture, we should be doing things like net flows. That gives us data about the communications that are happening on our network. We can see what ports and protocols are being used, what hosts are talking to one another. And by the way, this is a fantastic starting point when it talks about how you do network segmentation. Where's your start point? Net flows can be probably the best way to do that, because you're not going to just sit there and watch all the alerts and activity scroll by on your firewall. You will bang your head into a desk. But if you can look at the summarization of what things are communicating with what and how they're doing so, that can be a good way of trying to determine what you should be starting to build policies and stuff around. Endpoint activities, things like EDR, file changes, stuff like that. Identity events, so logins. How many of you have logged failed logins? Okay, a few of you. How about successes? Okay, a few. Why should you also log successes in addition to fails? In case they got access. So if you see something about a bunch of fails, what harm is a fail? What actual harm is a fail? Nothing, right? It's just someone failed to authenticate. Okay. No harm. What happens if there's multiple failed authentications from the same exact user, and all of a sudden there is a success? And you don't log successes. Well, if that was a brute force attempt, well, now that you don't know when that attacker actually gained access to your environment because you didn't log that particular activity. You can use things like that to help build detections around brute force or password spree attempts. Cloud logs, things about API activities, cloud-based communications, authentication or activity logs, application layers, so web requests, database access logs, things like that. There is an insurmountable amount of things you could potentially look at for logging. So where do you start? Well, fortunately enough, just recently, CISA, in collaboration with the Australian Signals Directorate's Australian Cyber Security Center, published some SIM and SOAR best practices. And here is a link, which is very, very long, to that. I also generated this QR code myself, and I checked and it works. If you don't trust it, that's fine. There's the URL. I provide both. But this is actually a starting guide for what CISA is recommending that you should be logging. This includes everything you should be logging from the three main cloud providers, everything you should be logging for Windows systems, Linux systems, and Mac, things on your network, everything. It gives you basically that starting line. So here's your guidance. Here's where you can have a starting place. Strategies. There's different approaches we can do. One of the most important things is time. When we're taking in log sources from different systems, they need to have the right time. Because how can we possibly correlate what happened at the firewall, what happened at a host, what happened on a server, what happened on a database, if we don't know what time any of those things happened? Time is the key to tying everything together. So the best way to handle that is to have some sort of lockdown NTP system that you trust and have all of your systems pull from that. That way, regardless, the time is always going to correlate. So that way you can actually watch as an attacker moves through your environment based off of the things they do. Collect logs from everywhere. So not just your on-premise systems, but also from the cloud. Collect those things. Sometimes, unfortunately, those do require an additional subscription and more money. Not that there's any companies that would charge for logs. But those things do exist, and unfortunately, they are challenges. Normalize and enrich data for easier analysis. So take the different sources, combine them, normalize them, get your IP fields, for example. You might have one log from one comes in as src_IP for source IP address. Another one might be source, SOURCE underscore IP. Another one might just be SRC IP. Correlate, determine what format you want those in, normalize them across the landscape. That when you're looking for a particular threat actor's IP address, you can search across all of your logs. You can also enrich those with threat intelligence, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. Centralize these into a SIEM. So have a central repository where all these logs go to perform these activities. Integrate threat intelligence in your SIEM. So when we talked about threat modeling and understanding what attackers are doing in your particular industry, what your competitors and other people in your industry are dealing with, take that information, once you've validated that it actually is applicable and it's high quality data and actionable data, integrate that into your SIEM. So, if there's an exposed C2 infrastructure for a particular threat actor that's targeting your industry, and you have all those IP addresses, pump that into your SIEM and have it do correlation searches across all of your logs. And if anything alerts, you know you already have a problem. And then for network traffic, monitor egress as well as ingress. We already talked about why that's important, because the attacker is already in our environment trying to escape with whatever they're trying to escape with. So what kind of challenges do we have when it comes to this? Well, data overload. Who's worked in a SOC? Or at least responded to alerts? Who's had alert fatigue? Yeah, we want to make sure that we're prioritizing things that are actually actionable, not just sending logs and firing off alerts. Because if it's not actionable, and then eventually people are going to get exhausted and they're going to miss something. Cost. Storing logs costs money. Bringing in more data costs money. Anybody here a customer of Splunk? Yeah, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Shadow IT and unmanaged assets. Again, going back to knowing what we have. If there's a bunch of devices on your network that you don't know what they are, you can't get logs from them. If there's somebody in a particular business unit that just plugs in a router because you don't have ports locked down, and now they've got their own little home router that they're running, and so they can run their personal devices off of it on your network, and you don't know about that because you're not monitoring everything, that's a problem. Ensuring log integrity and retention. Logs need to be retained in some situations for a specific period of time. You don't want to retain them forever because, one, again, they're expensive. And two, you run into liability concerns after a certain period of time. But you do have a minimum situation and certain types of records that you have to maintain. So making sure that they're untampered with and that you keep them around as long as you need them. A few years ago, the average, and I think it's pretty much stayed right around the same, the average time an advanced persistent threat or a nation-state type actor is in an environment is usually right around 180 days, 90 to 180 days, so 3 to 6 months. Do you have 3 to 6 months of logs available? Maybe, depending on who you are, how long you're keeping stuff. The default, I think, for most things is like 90 days, maybe 30, depending on how much you're storing. So if you're only keeping 30 days worth of logs and an attacker's been in your environment for 6 months, you have no idea how they initially got in and what they've done since they got there. Nor will the authorities. When the FBI is helping you with the investigation, they're not going to have access to that information either because it didn't exist. Gaps in encrypted and east-west traffic visibility. So one of the biggest challenges with IDS deployments comes in the fact that there are different network segments, and depending on how your network is architected, you might have a core switch or core router, and then you might have edge switches at various locations. And I tried to have ChatGPT generate me a good graphic for this, but it was terrible. Depending on where that traffic goes, you may or may not see it. If a particular switch is out at the edge, and you've got devices for that particular business unit that are communicating on the same VLAN, and when they go out to the internet, yes, you might see it go back through your core router and out to the internet. So say you've got your IDS connected in off of the span interface for your core router. Well, what happens if a device on there is trying to compromise and doing like port scans on another device off of that same switch in that same VLAN? You don't see it. So you need to actually have a sensor out that far into the network. So depending on what you're trying to accomplish, you need to make sure that you have your IDSs deployed appropriately so that you have the adequate level of visibility. Now, unfortunately, that also scales with cost. So you have to weigh the cost and benefit of doing that. The other thing is, 10, 15 years ago, not everything, hardly anything was encrypted on our networks. Now almost everything is, or should be. So when we're talking about the things that we own, that we're doing decryption on, we want to make sure we're actually decrypting those communications. Otherwise, we're not getting a lot of data out of it. We can't get actionable alerts. And in addition to that, that's also more resource provisioning that is required on the devices doing the decryption, whether that's your switches or whether that's your sensor for your IDS. So you have to take that into account as well. And then one that requires a very special call-out is IPv6. How many of you are using IPv6 on your networks? Okay. How many of you don't think you're actually using IPv6 on your networks? A few of you. Do you have it complete? So the rest of you must have it completely disabled on every single device in your network. Is that correct? A couple of you. Okay, good job. The point of the matter is IPv6 in most places is a blind spot. Why? Because we're still not using it. We're still using IPv4, especially internally. And IPv6, if you're not using it, it's still on your network, unless you've completely disabled it from every single device, which, by the way, is against Microsoft's best practices. If you actually read, if you open a case with Microsoft about a networking issue, and they find out that you've disabled IPv6 on your servers, they're going to tell you need to fix that by turning it back on. Because their best practices and recommendations are that you have that enabled. The problem with that is if you are not monitoring for IPv specific threats and activities, you have a complete blind spot that threat actors could be manipulating and you would never know it. Right. Threat detection and response, digging a little bit deeper into IDS. So there are network and host-based IDS, just like there are network and host-based firewalls. They serve pretty much the same purpose. The difference is on host-based, you can get a little bit more details about what specific things are being targeted. You might just see the actual communication, but not actually what's going on. You see a lot more at the host level. You're looking for signs of compromise in either of those. You're detecting known and unknown attack patterns by either signatures or heuristics. These help provide an early warning for internal and external threats, provided that you're actually looking at your alerts. If you first plug in an IDS and you just load in the base like snort rule set, it's incredibly noisy. It requires a ton of tuning to actually get it appropriate for your environment. Every single environment's going to be different. And you might even have every single sensor at different, let's say you have a multi-location company. Each location might have different rule sets deployed because of how they actually operate. One of the manufacturing facilities I worked at, we had manufacturing facilities all around the world. And every single environment was completely unique. So what we monitored at one place was not necessarily what we had to monitor at another. And we had to tune appropriately. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of noise. And inevitably, if you have enough noise, you're going to miss something. And again, it requires thoughtful placement in the network to make sure you have the appropriate level of visibility. You may not be able to effectively or cost-effectively deploy a sensor to every single edge switch in your environment. Figure out what ones are critical and important, and deploy there. SIM and SOAR, we're looking at correlating log sources in the SIM. Already talked about that. Integrating threat intelligence. We also want to try and automate response playbooks. So things that are repetitive actions that our incident responders or SOC analysts are doing day in, day out, anytime they're actually doing something, or anytime they come into a particular situation, whether it's ripping an email out of somebody's mailbox, resetting a password, disabling an account, have automated playbooks and stuff in a SOAR platform that makes that a click of a button, or maybe fully automated, depending on the situation. Leverage EDLs, or external dynamic lists. This allows for more rapid deployment of allows or blocks at the network and firewall level. These are basically lists that you run on a platform like MISP or something like that, or a threat intel platform, a TIP, to where your firewalls are looking at this list, and then if there's something that comes up, maybe even through a threat intel source, it can add those IP addresses to that list The firewalls then curl that list, and they're already updated and blocking that. Sometimes you can integrate the threat intelligence directly at the firewall level. Not all of them work. And then I also help you retain evidence for forensic analysis and or legal action if it should have come to that. And again, CISA in combination with Australia put together a guidance for implementing SIM and SOAR platforms just a few days ago. Again, link, QR code. Detection engineering. So I'm not going to dig deep into this one because I gave an entire talk about this last year. These are the two QR codes. The first one is the YouTube video. Second one is the slides. There's also those links. So I dig really deep into things like Sigma, snort roll, stuff like that, detection engineering. Basically taking things a step further from what your vendors can actually provide. See some phones up, so I'll give everybody a moment here. All right. Active defense. So active defense means basically we are putting things out there to try and ensure that threat actors make mistakes. We're doing something more active than just gathering data and hoping for the best or trying to find when something's happened. And some of the ways we do that are honeypots, putting out intentionally vulnerable machines. Maybe that looks like an ICS system. Or maybe that looks like a domain controller. Or maybe it looks like a database of customers. Or entire networks of things like that. We might also put particular files out there, like customer lists, or employee files, things like that, that are intentionally left there and have no legitimate business purpose. There is no legitimate activity that will ever happen with a honeypot, a honeynet, or a honey token. So anytime somebody does anything with one of those, it's bad behavior. So you have them at go. The first time it happens, you know something's wrong. Whether it's an employee that's doing something they're not supposed to, or whether it's a threat actor in your environment that's trying to pivot, trying to access or steal data, something like that. Basically, this is taking everything and ensuring that we have these traps set. Some additional considerations when it comes to cloud and hybrid networks. So again, we moved away from the castle and moat methodology. So some of the challenges we have are reduced visibility into cloud-native traffic and APIs, just because they're no longer in our perimeter. There's also complex identity and access management systems, and every single one of them is unique between each cloud provider. There's also inconsistent security controls between on-prem, cloud, and each different cloud provider for multi-cloud. So some of the things we can do, leverage the cloud-native security tools. So there's things like security groups and stuff like that for pretty much all of them. They might call them slightly different things. Leverage the pre-existing and native capabilities that these cloud providers give you. Try and tie everything back to single sign-on. Try and do federated access. That way, if you disable an account one place, it disables it everywhere. Centralized logging and monitoring. So bring your logs into your SIEM, whether they're from your cloud providers or your on-prem stuff. Ensure secure connectivity. So if you're connecting to your cloud provider, a lot of times people use cloud companies as basically like another office. It's like a VPN communication. So it's just an extension. Case study, NotPetya. How many of you have heard of NotPetya? Okay, how many of you lived through NotPetya? Okay, a few of you. So most of us as defenders hate malware. This is true. I love NotPetya. I'm like obsessively fascinated by it. It is probably my most favorite piece of malware because of how it worked. It was like a thriller spy novel in a piece of malware. My wife and I have recently been rewatching all of the Mission Impossible movies, which, by the way, they did not age as well, especially the one from '96. But like that whole, spy concept and the subterfuge and everything else was all built into NotPetya. So NotPetya happened in July. I didn't actually get the exact date. It happened in July of 2017. Not even quite 2 months after WannaCry happened. And there's a couple different reasons for that. So WannaCry was an accident that basically caused a whole bunch of problems globally for anybody that had legacy systems that had MS-17, or excuse me, CVE 2017-144, which was the SMB1 vulnerability. They also, NotPetya leveraged that exact same one, but it took it a lot of steps further. So it started out being deployed through this MEDoc software update, which was I believe, a financial software application for like Ukrainian companies. When it got on a system, it did a variety of things. This was before like AI and ML. This was truly like almost a polymorphic malware. So the first thing it tried to do was see if it could elevate and get administrative privileges on the host. And it did that in a couple different ways. One, we talked about the cache credentials. So it used a modified version of Mimikatz to actually dump the hash credentials that were actually on, or cache credentials that were in the box. And then it tried to see if there was any of those that were an admin. Whether that was a local admin account, whether that was a domain admin account, or whether it was just a system account that had privileges on the other systems in the network. Then it would first try and use the SMB1 Eternal Blue vulnerability to see if it could pivot to other. Are we going to work? There we go. So it would use the Eternal Blue exploit and see if it could pivot to anywhere on the network. It would scan the network and see what other things it was communicating with, and see if any of those were vulnerable to Eternal Blue. Failing that, there was another vulnerability around the same time. I think those were also related to the Vault 7 stuff. For Eternal Romance, it would try and see if that exploit would work. Failing that, it would then use those cache credentials that it stole to try and BSexec or WMIC from that host to all those other systems. And if that was a local admin credential that was on that particular workstation, and that's the same password you use for every single one in your deployment, whether that's 10 or 10,000 systems, it used that to propagate to every single one of those. And now it had local admin privileges on every single box. What it did from there is it tried to access every single map share, as well as the local hard drive, and then encrypted them like it was ransomware. The problem was, it wasn't ransomware. It was just a data destroyer. What it did was, it basically did the whole encryption process like you would have for ransomware, but it disposed of the key. There was no way to do decryption, because it was meant to destroy data, not ransom it. Furthermore, investigating the actual behaviors and the TTPs that were leveraged, it looked like North Korea, almost exactly. And it took a lot, so attribution almost immediately pointed to North Korea for this. However, after a lot of very smart people did further digging into it, it was actually, it's been attributed to the Russian hacking group Sandworm, who was masquerading using the TTPs of North Korean hackers to target the Ukraine. This is where the whole spy subterfuge comes in. It's not, they were using nation state techniques of a totally separate nation state to redirect where the focus was going for this, so that they could cause harm. But going back to our defensible networks approach, which I know I've got just a couple more minutes left. So with the compromised host itself, if we were using LAPS, that prevents local admin accounts from being able to pivot to other systems on the network. If we were using separated accounts and not using admin privileges to log into workstations, that eliminates that ability for them to pivot. If we're patching systems, Eternal Blue and Eternal Romance were blocked because we'd patched those. The patch existed for, I think, roughly a year before these cyber events happened. And if we don't allow our users to use BSexec or WMIC on their workstations, that would have been blocked as well. So if we harden things now, which would have greatly limited what this could actually do. So some common pitfalls, incomplete asset inventory. Again, going back, we cannot protect everything if we don't know what all we have. Over-reliance on perimeter firewalls. The whole concept of, well, as long as we've got our perimeter protected, the threat actors can't hurt us. Again, the threat actor is already inside our network. Poor segmentation or VLANs without filtering. We put in a bunch of VLANs, we're good. We've segmented everything out, all of our systems are secure. Except for if we didn't apply filtering, all we did was just basically create a bunch of rooms in a house and then leave the doors open. Logging without monitoring. If you have all these tools that are sending logs in, all these things that are generating alerts, but no one is looking at them, it does you no good. Lack of network visibility, not actually having sensors deployed appropriately. And then either overcomplicating the design or ignoring the user experience. Because if you ignore the user experience or make things difficult on users, they will find ways to work against you. And it's not because they're malicious. They're just trying to do their job and you're making it harder for them. They're going to find a way around it. So, real quick roadmap. It doesn't cost to be built around business processes. Security is there to enable the business. We're there to enable them to do it securely. We need to make sure that their process is at the heart of everything we do. Determine our desired state. Where do we want to be? We don't necessarily need to have NSA level configurations of security in our environment. That's not how every single business is going to work. But we should determine where we should be, where we want to be, compare that to where our current state is, and then do a gap analysis, and those are the things we can do after. As far as trying to, how to approach it, target things like basic hygiene first. Patching, MFA, logging. Next phase, start trying to actually segment things out, monitoring a little bit deeper, doing some threat modeling. Then ultimately try and strive for some level of zero trust, automating things, building resilience entirely into the environment. Then there's some different frameworks that you can reference. MITRE ATT&CK, there's actually a zero trust architecture framework, 800-207, and then some of the other like risk controls. So in summary, architect for a breach, not just for prevention. We want to harden our systems, segment our networks, develop strong identity and authentication protection, ensure that we have adequate visibility to our logs and our network, ensure we're actively monitoring our alerts and detections, not just firing them off into a black hole, and develop automations to increase our incident response agility. Thank you. I don't know if we have any time for any questions. If there's any questions, otherwise I'll turn it over to Matt.
Oh, you got one right there.
Oh, yes.
So you talked about monitoring of east-west traffic.
Yes.
What do you think about north-south traffic? Like, for when we are talking about.
So the question was, I talked about monitoring east-west traffic. What about north-south traffic? 9 times out of 10, we usually monitor north-south traffic, which is going to be between network segments, things that are leaving our zones, like going from our internal network to the internet. We're monitoring those usually at that border firewall. Going from the internet, an untrusted place, to our DMCA slightly trusted place. We're usually monitoring the north-south traffic there, but we're not monitoring what actually usually goes in it. Because there's a lot more communications that happen within our network than leave our network. So I didn't really talk about north-south traffic because usually we're already doing some level of that if we have a border firewall. It's the east-west traffic that we're usually going to. Great question.